Hey, everybody, I'm Jesse.
I'm Maeve.
And I'm Jim.
And this is Boring Conversation.
Welcome to Boring Conversation, a Malifaux podcast.
Hey, everybody, we're back again. This time with my dear friends Maeve and Jim. Say hello to everybody, Maeve and Jim, even though I just made you do it a couple of seconds ago.
Hello.
Hey, everybody.
All right, so why don't we just take a quick second and just catch people up on what we've been doing lately, and if we have anything to plug. Maeve, why don't you take it away?
All right. Well, believe it or not, and I know you guys haven't heard from it in a while, but Bayou Breakdown has a couple new episodes that are going to be out within the next month, where we delve into some of the lore of Malifaux with our help from the Defective Dice YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that. I'm really excited for those to pop up. Also, please go check out Foxtail Games, which is my actual play podcast where we play RPGs and you get to listen. Jim was actually in our first season, which just wrapped up, and it was totally awesome. And Jim was absolutely amazing. So please go check it out. And then our second season just got started, and it's going to be hopefully as good as the first season.
Fantastic. I had no idea that there were more Bayou Breakdown episodes in queue for release, so that's very exciting, especially because I really need more lore in my life. Right now, Defective Dice and a little bit of Steam-Powered Scoundrels are my only fixes, and I'd really like to diversify my my knowledge of the background of the game and lore, so that's awesome. And Jim, why don't you tell us what you have going on?
Yeah, so I have not been on it often, but the Other Coast is still putting out some pretty great content. They're out of Los Angeles. Jeff and Colgan have been covering a whole bunch of different topics and exploring the game with I'll say, a critical eye. And I think it's a refreshing listen. So I really encourage everyone to give it added to their rotation for the podcastings. But personally, I've actually been volunteering with this organization / benefit event, Megan's Saving Throw. A friend of mine from my online RP days was putting this benefit together for a friend of his who's getting treatment for a cancer. And so we just had a weekend of doing pay-to-play role plays, and I ran 2 different games there. So that was a big to-do. But that's kind of kept me away from the faux scene for the last little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really fantastic thing that you've been doing for sure. Cancer's a real bitch. I think we all know that. And I know that there are more than a few people, both in the Malifaux community and the larger gaming communities that I am a part of, that have had their lives touched and affected by it. So anybody that can go out and roll some dice and help raise some money for cancer, hell yeah, I'm all for it. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
And then I myself, obviously, I did put out the Steam-Powered Scoundrels collaboration episode fairly recently, but we have had a bit of a break from regular podcast releases lately. And without getting into all the gory details, I'll just say that I'm recording on a new computer right now, along with some other new hardware, and things seem to be going pretty well so far. So here's to hoping that sticks out. Other stuff that I would like to plug, I don't really have any new projects that I'm involved with at the moment, although I did want to share some pretty cool news that I, during the little, enforced podcast recording break, I did take my beer judge certification program tasting exam for the second time. First time I passed, but in order to qualify for higher ranks, I'm shooting for national rank, which there's only a fairly small percentage of beer judges, certified beer judges that attain that rank. You have to get above a certain threshold on the tasting exam. and I probably won't find out my results for a good solid 3 to 4 months because it takes a long time to get through the grading queue. But yeah, very, very excited for that. It was a lot of fun and just, yeah, very fulfilling. Even if I don't end up getting the score that I was looking for, it was great. Aside from that, I do actually have 2 other friends' projects that I would like to plug. We do have my dear co-host Jake on the pod fairly often. He hasn't been on lately, but a lot of that is because he's been heavily involved with his own podcast, Actual Play RPG, which he has plugged on the show before, Nastygram. They do actually have a new season that just started rolling. They call them arcs. This arc is set in one of my most very favorite settings, which is the Vampire the Masquerade setting, and they are using the new 5th edition rule set. It's the first time that any of them have used it, and it's been a lot of fun to listen to. That's probably the setting that Jake and most of that crew have the most experience with, and they are just chewing up the scenery in it. It's fantastic.
I love Vampire. I haven't done it in so long. I don't think I've played since like 2nd edition. So it's been a while.
Yeah, same thing for me. I don't think I've played since 2nd edition either. I actually gifted them a bunch of all of my old collection of like RPG source books and core rules for games that, I'm probably never going to play again, like an old Warhammer, Warhammer Quest or whatever they call it, fantasy role-playing system, the big core rule book that's like 1,000 pages thick. Mm-hmm. Some old 1st edition D&D stuff. Since they reprinted it all, it doesn't really have any value anymore. It just kind of takes up space on the shelf, but they were happy to frame it up and put it around the room. And the 2nd edition like ultimate storytellers rule book and DM screen from Vampire were probably one of the coolest things that I was happy to see put to good use. They're going to have a fun time with that. But last but not least, I actually do have yet another friend who is on the Nastygram podcast. My friend John and his co-host actually have started another new podcast, which is near and dear to my heart, called Chip's Groove Radio, where they rate and review video game soundtracks. Specifically, right now they're doing mostly like older style chiptune stuff, hence the name of the podcast, 16-bit and 8-bit era primarily, but they've done some other new stuff recently as well, and I've really been enjoying listening to it so much. So I love video game music so much so that my voice might sound a little raspy right now because my wife and I actually went on a date last night to go see the Video Games Live Orchestra up in Boston at Symphony Hall. They were playing with the Boston Pops for the first time ever, and that was a hell of a show, I gotta tell you.
What were they
highly
playing?
recommended. They played, I could go through the whole set list, but long story short, they had the original composer for World of Warcraft playing a World of Warcraft, conducting a World of Warcraft suite. They also had the original composer for Halo doing a Halo suite from the first 3 games essentially. One of the composers and the lead vocalist for Advent Rising, which is like a pretty old PlayStation, I think it was on PlayStation, RPG standalone game. Mm-hmm. And they also played stuff from like real classics like Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross, Kingdom Hearts, Tetris, which was wild and incredibly fun. Yeah, very, very, very cool and absolutely worth it if they come in your area. So that's all the plugs I got. I know I was kind of droning on for a little bit, and I've been talking so much that I need to wet my whistle. So I am going to let you guys take it away and tell me what you're drinking while I rehydrate, so to speak.
Right. I actually have a Winking Owl Sangria today.
Cool. Is that a red or a white sangria?
It's a red.
Fantastic.
And I love sangria. It's delicious. It's so good. I would drink it probably over any other like fruit based alcohol. Like, it's just one of my favorite things.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially during the summer, my sister and I both really love like white sangrias with like peaches and all sorts of other tasty stuff like that. Very, very tasty. How about yourself, Jim? What you got?
I'm very exciting. I've got myself a mug of Fairlife 2% milk and just sipping away at it like it's a dessert drink.
I should send you some coffee syrup from Rhode Island. Then you could have coffee milk. It's like a regional thing.
I would be down for that.
I'll make sure I make that happen. So we will convene afterwards so that we can trade addresses, and I will get some to you lickety split.
I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I myself am drinking a Saison de Foam from Foam Brewers in Burlington, Vermont. Saison is one of my personal favorite styles. This one's a pretty good one for a podcast because it's a low alcohol one. It's only about 4.5% ABV. And they did a really good job with it. I gotta say, it's great, and it's tough to make a Saison that's that low alcohol because they tend to come out kind of watery. But this one's fantastic. So now that we've gotten through all the intros and the drinks, Maeve, this episode was kind of your brainchild. So why don't you take it away? Tell us what we're talking about tonight.
All right. So what I was thinking about doing actually is like really talking about like having a series of episodes where we really kind of talk about how we build lists, you know, like what we're looking at. And we've done a couple things before where we've talked about like, you know, if we were going to build a you know, like a menagerie of masters to bring to a tournament, what would we do, and that sort of thing. But I really thought it would be cool to dig in and talk about like the tech picks, the things that, you know, if you have like a solid list that you like to play, but sometimes you reach and you pull these other things. What are you pulling, and why are you pulling those things? And also, like, how much is too much? Like, you know, do you counter pick for your master a lot or just a little? And I brought Jim on here because like Jim and I have played a ton back and forth, and I think we've both got like an idea of like how often we do little like tech things towards each other, and I was interested to see like what he thought about like when we go to those tournaments, like how many times do you reach into your bag and pull out your sort of like silver bullet characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that it's kind of funny because I feel like I do a great job at thinking about tech and thinking about what I need to take into a particular master, or even in some cases, what do I need to take depending on what the table is set up like. But then when it comes time for actual list building, it's like half the time all that knowledge just goes right out the window, and I end up making a very on the rails list that I'm comfortable with, and just forget that like, oh, hey, if I'm playing into guild, he's going to have probably 2 models with laugh off. So like my whole plan to move him off these markers isn't going to work. So what do I do now? Mm-hmm. Or I'll be playing into Hoffman and just like forget that I need to tech in an armor piercing model. Stuff like that. So I talk the talk, but I don't necessarily walk the walk. There's a lot of oopses during deployment with me. So yeah.
Well, and I think that's definitely
I'm gonna get a lot out of it.
I think that's definitely something to talk about too, is like, you know, we do spend a lot of time like thinking about like, oh, we're gonna take this, and then like I find a lot of times that I'll like default to a specific thing, and then sometimes you regret it, and sometimes like you think, oh well, maybe we didn't need that so much. And I do think that like when we specifically start talking about like counter picks and, you know, like specifically countering certain keywords, I would be interested to see what y'all's opinions are on like which keywords are we like really worried about and really wanting to counter pick against.
Yeah, I think that there's a certain amount of, it's kind of like a dividing line between, I think, different levels of play. You don't necessarily have to be a strong counter picker to be a solid opponent, but I feel like if you've got your crew nailed down and you know your plan and you know how to stick to it and you know what you need to do to score your points, that having the meta knowledge either of your local group, knowing what your common opponents are going to be taking to the table and what you might be able to pull out of your little bag of tricks to throw them for a loop to get a little bit of an edge. And then certainly for top level play, I think that tech picking and counter picking plays a significant role in that. I mean, if you're rolling up the top table at a big event like a, you know, Houston GT or a Nova or what have you, and you really only know how to play your crew, you could be playing it at 99% efficiency, but you're probably going to be at some sort of a disadvantage if you don't have some sense of what you need to bring to crack the code of your opponent's crew. So with that said, before we really get into the topic at hand, it's been a little while since Maeve and I and Jim have really gotten a chance to catch up. So why don't y'all just tell us what you've been up to? Maeve, why don't you take it away?
I have a crap load of painting to do. I decided I was going to take, so I bought all my angler stuff and I've got it all painted and it looks pretty good. I'm still working on like the basing. I have like a basing scheme for them, but I'm going a little extra. So I'm taking my time, which means in the meantime, I'm going to be going to Houston actually next week to play in one of their local tournaments. I'll be down that way anyway. So I'm going to be running some Neverborn, which is a little break from the Bayou for me, which doesn't happen super often. Every time I go away from the Bayou, I end up just sliding right back in. So I don't think it'll last long, but I have this gorgeous painted Dreamer crew that I really want to get out there. Other than that, my local game store closed a couple months ago. They had a huge sale, and my second love is Marvel Crisis Protocol, and I spent way too much money when they were like, oh, everything's 60% off. So I have like probably like 40 models to finish painting for MCP. So that kind of helps me because now I can be like, okay, I'm not buying anymore till I paint all of this. And then they release a Cosmic Ghost Rider model that looks so amazing that's coming out in July. And I'm going, can I get all these painted before July? Can I do it?
It's funny. Oh, boy. Yeah, for me, it's been a lot of it has been me continuing to tell myself that I'm going to get back to Bayou and I'm going to play more Bayou games and I'm going to get more comfortable with them before Nova again, because that's what I intend to take. And then stuff like Red Library happens and I'm like, oh, hey, this seems like kind of a dark horse crew in terms of Manda's Malifaux anyway. I mean, it was probably the one that I think drove the least excitement from a rules perspective. So I took it upon myself to try and figure them out, to crack the code, see what I could use them in. And I think every game that I've played since then, for the most part, has been with Red Library. So I've been on a pretty strong kick with them. Really looking forward to getting some of those models in. I haven't put together any of them yet, but I do have the Lynn 2 and Damien box so that I can work on her. And then my stories box actually just came in, I think, a couple of days ago. So I'm probably going to pick that up next week from the shop. So very excited there. Other than that, I've been working on getting an Angler assembled. Once I do finally say, okay, I'm going to get back into Bayou seriously, I've only got a couple of games in with Angler so far, and I've really enjoyed them. So I think that it's probably going to be using them to get comfortable with them, and most importantly, get comfortable against them before some of the big events coming up happen. Because I think there's a better chance of me playing against them than using them. And then because I have some sort of strange faction ADD thing going on, I was like, hey, you know what? I haven't played Ivan in a while, so I think I'll play a couple of games with him. And he's still just as fun as he used to be, even if he's not quite as good. So that really got to, kind of be in my bonnet. And I started assembling and converting a project that I had in mind for a long time to get his whole crew rebased and put like lampposts on all the DUA models bases and do cobblestone base toppers for all of them, little shadow effects for all the times that I'm actually going to take them to a tournament, which is like probably never. But still, it looks really cool. And then last but not least, it's really just getting ready for Nova. I told myself that this is the year that I go. I keep meaning to, and then stuff comes up in real life. This time, nothing's going on, and it's looking like there's a 99% chance that I'll be there. I would say there's also a very good chance that I'll be at the Houston GT, which happens to be pretty much my birthday weekend. So that will be phenomenal if I can swing that one. Yeah, that's what I got. How about you, Jim?
It's going to be more of the same. I've been I haven't been picking up any new crews of late. Somehow I've avoided that. Instead, I've been painting through my backlog. So I think in the last 2 months, when I've been focused on foe, I've finished painting my Pandora crew, finished painting up the last little bit of Ulix. I got all of the pigs built, painted, based. Tonight I'm watching the basing texture paint dry on my last obliteration models. I finally painted the 33 because I converted a 33 for last year's Nova. Because if anyone remembers second edition Death Marshals, there was one sculpt that was like massive compared to the other two, and he's like squatting. Fits perfectly on a 40 mil. But now I have the official sculpt, and it's really nice. So that, and what did I do last week? I think last week I finished up another Mei Fang. I've been playing a lot of Mei Fang lately in Arcanists because robots are fun. I partially blame you, Jesse, after the Rusty Rumble. But yeah, the faction hopping is real.
Yeah.
There's just so much to try and play these days. I played a bunch of Zip at Richmond Open, which was the last big event I went to. And what's funny there is that I was building up the entire like month and a half before Richmond Open. I was playing Witness and practicing Witness because I was saying, you know what, I'm gonna continue the crusade that other players have started. And then I get to there and I just go, I can't do it. And so I played Zip, and it was a lot more fun. And that, I
know.
It is what it is.
It's okay.
I am hopeful that I will be able to play the Witness, because the Witness models, all the new Madness sculpts are phenomenal. I've seen.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably some of the best, if not the best looking models that we've seen come out of Weird probably ever. I think they really knocked it out of the park with, I mean, really the entire book release. They're all fantastic.
Yeah.
I look forward to the day I can play them and not get the eye roll. That's all I'm saying.
Hey, who knows? Maybe you'll see an errata on him before Nova, and then you can just play the brandy new version of whatever he turns out to be.
I gotta say that I don't know about Nova this year. I'm hoping I'll be able to make it, but it's just timing and money, and fingers crossed that I can get there this year because it'll be a lot of fun. If anything, I might like skip the first 2 days and come for the last 2 days, but we'll see. I just like going and hanging out with people, so that's the best part of it.
If you do make it, I will love to see you there. It'll be fantastic.
I need to get my ass up to Boston is what needs to happen.
Hey, it's a nice city. What can I say? Horrific traffic, but nice city.
Let's jump into the meat and potatoes of our episode. We're going to talk about what is a tech pick and why do you need the tech pick. So I think it's really important. The tech pick, to me specifically, is anything that lets you reach in and specialize for either or for just multiple aspects of a game. So when you're looking at like the terrain on the board, very specific strategies or schemes that you have to like change your base list that you normally play to to work with this particular game. It also includes what we usually call counter tech, which is where you're countering what your opponent is bringing. So there are some keywords that like you've got to be very careful about because you want to make sure that like if you don't counter them, they get to just do whatever they want. So for instance, like Jackdaw, right? If you don't have Ruthless against Jackdaw, you're probably in a lot of trouble right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me
Yeah.
is what tech picks in particular are. Jim, what do you think?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. So, like, just to expound a bit on that concept of a core crew. Folks who will listen to any of the podcasts out there will hear that there's a core crew for most keywords, and they're usually models you're hiring regardless of circumstance. And there's usually a flex amount of stones, and then those will be what you use to tailor to what you're facing. I mean, list building in Malifaux is by design after you know what you're up against and what you're playing on and what the scenario is. So tech picking is kind of part of the DNA of the game.
Mm-hmm.
There is an argument to be made, especially for newer players, to focus on playing like a set list. Like, this is your 50 stones, play this for X number of games until you know it in and out. But to your point, Jesse, from earlier, once you've played a fair bit of Malifaux, you can start to get away from that set list and start adjusting on the fly, sort of like going from driving an automatic vehicle to a manual vehicle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like we're going to kind of get into this a little bit later about, potentially taking too many tech picks, but identifying what exactly your core crew is, once you get past that first, 5 games or whatever it takes you to get comfortable with it, is pretty critical. I mean, I'll use an example just because I've been thinking about Ma a lot lately. I talk about her all the time. She's one of my favorite masters. There's a certain number of models that I can pare down her quote core crew to, and the style that I play her in, it's usually going to be, typically speaking, Matok at 1, and it's going to be a mix of 3 models that are kind of split up between Bayou Bushwhackers and Rooster Riders, depending on what the scenario is and what the table looks like. And then there's some other supplemental models that I don't necessarily have to bring. I would like to bring them, but they're the ones that I have to consider subbing out if I need to bring in something to counter a specific master. Or if I have a good sense that they're going to be bringing a particular model into a crew that I know that I'm going to have a tough time dealing with. Ma Tucket, a good example of something that she can struggle with at times is armor on or mitigation on models that tend to stay at range and don't get close to the middle. Other than that, she's just got a bunch of kind of like Min 2 guns that are going to do, 1 damage, even if they hit moderate, because most of their moderates are 3. Not great for dealing with something like a Melissa Core, for example. She's going to sit back. She's going to charge back and forth in the backfield and plug away at my front line and just chew me to pieces because I don't really have a way to get to grips with her. So then I have to think about taking a specific model to deal with that model on the enemy side of the table. Or, let's say, just the table itself is going to be difficult. There's a lot of severe terrain, and my crew that I've taken doesn't really have a great way to answer that. Ulix would be a good example. So I got a bunch of, pigs on big bases, and there's like a bunch of rivers or forests, and I'm going to have a tough time moving around. Well, regardless of what my opponent actually brings for masters or models, I really have to consider taking something like an Aramanthian boar or hiring in wild boars instead of maybe piglets or something else because they have the unimpeded. Like there's a lot of stuff that goes into it.
I am a big fan of, I always say, wild boars are highly underrated.
Yeah.
They are solid models, especially in a crew that just does not have a lot of unimpeded. Like, that's one of the things when we'll talk about, like, can you build lists that don't necessarily need to tech? There are lists that have the tech sort of built into. So, like, something like Ulix can, the flexibility of Ulix is what makes him a potentially, like, very strong keyword to play. See, I think the thing about tech picking that like, especially if you're a new player, to think about is tech picks have 2 very specific components to them. that you really need to have to fully understand like why or how to tech pick. Number one, you need to have game knowledge. So like if your opponent, especially for counter tech, right? If your opponent says, "Hey, this is this is what I'm playing, like this is my faction," and you know specifically that like this faction does really well or has the potential to drop something like Jackdaw, where Ruthless could be important, um, then you want to start looking for that. But you also kind of have to have like different than game knowledge is game experience. If you've played against, and I'll use it as an example again, if you've played against Jackdaw 5-6 times, you're now going to know like what it is specifically that you need to work with in order to stop Jackdaw. And some of those things genuinely don't happen until you've dropped it on the table and made the mistake of like not bringing anything to stop that particular combo or crew, or like you make the mistake of like, oh, I'm just going to take my regular crew, but there's a lot of severe on the board, and now I've had to either split my crew up around this giant section of severe, or you've gone through the severe and you've lost a lot of your like ability to get across the board because you've spent more turns walking than, or more actions walking than you should have.
Yeah.
And that's the two components really. I mean, like, you can, I guess you guys can add on to that if you feel like there's anything else that really like informs how to pick or when to pick. But I feel like knowledge and experience are definitely those two things that
I think difference. I think that kind of encompasses a lot of it. The other thing that I would say is you really need to be aware of what your own crew's strengths and weaknesses are. It could very well be like, let's say I'm playing like a ranged heavy crew, like an Ophelia, or if I'm in Thunders, maybe playing like a ranged heavy Misaki 2 crew. And it happens to be in a strategy where I really do need to have some movement, but I didn't really think about that when I chose the master. I made a mistake, or I was more concerned about maybe the matchup and picked a less than ideal master into a particular pool. Well, sometimes you need to be able to tech just to be able to score your points. So like if I'm playing Ophelia, I'm not always going to take Sly, but there might be some pools where he's going to be the only really good scoring model that I can bring. And if he's not going to serve any purpose other than to try and score me points, and he's outside of my normal kind of comfort zone or typical crew, even though he's in keyword, I would still call him a tech pick in that situation, because I need to use him to accomplish a specific objective beyond dealing with enemy models to actually score or deny points.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think anybody that plays either Perdita or Ophelia would say that Sly is like is a must have in your crew. And that is an important thing too when you are, exploring a new keyword, is to explore what inside of your keyword is potentially a good tech pick for you. Like we were talking about with Ulix. Wild boars are really, really good, and they're much easier to make than a war pig is necessarily. And in some games you don't necessarily need a war pig.
Yeah, and taking that Ulix example into the Jackdaw example that we were talking about before, this really comes down to knowing, again, the weaknesses of your crews, not necessarily just from a scoring standpoint or dealing with the table of terrain, but dealing with the matchup. Like, there might be a couple of masters out there that could get by against Jackdaw without bringing in any additional Ruthless models. Maybe they happen to have some in keyword. Maybe they just have high stats. Maybe you're playing something like Shenlong, where you can kind of utilize Chi to get around a lot of those terrifying checks, so you can just kind of, push your way through. But if you're playing Ulix into a Jackdaw with all your willpower 4s and a couple of willpower 3s, like, you have to take some Ruthless upgrades or hire some Ruthless models out of keyword, or you're really, really going to have a bad game. I mean, there's just no way around it.
Yeah, like I like to frame it in the concept of questions and answers. Every crew poses a question of its opponent. Can you deal with ruthless? Can you deal with terrifying? Can you deal with armor 2 spam? And every crew has answers. And answers are these tech picks that we're talking about. Every faction has different answers. Every faction has a lot of the same answers, just in different places. Traditionally, Neverborn is known as a faction that doesn't like being shot. But they have access to things like stealth and creating cover. So, like, their way of dealing with it might be different than, say, Outcasts, where you can hire bulletproof models. Don't actually do that. Bulletproof is a terrible ability, but the point stands. Different factions have different.
Specifically, like Arcanists to have what, 2? Do they have 3 models with Eye of the Storm now?
Yeah,
they do, if you consider the captain actually a model.
Yeah,
I like the captain. Don't be mean to the captain. He does his best.
He does his best.
He does do his best.
But now you could just hire a wind golem out of keyword for the same cost,
Yes.
and it's awesome. So
they are pretty. The wind golem is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I guess I wanted to ask a question of you two,
Sure.
real quick. We know that keyword hiring is kind of like the default of 3rd edition, is that you're building your crew ideally from keyword elements. You have the option to hire out of keyword, and that's kind of where a lot of these tech picks live, is either in versatile models or specific models. Like, for example, Outcasts have Mad Dog Bracket with Blow It to Hell. So if anyone in Outcast needs to remove markers, you see him hired. For your crew building methods, how much out of keyword is too much? Is there a too much?
I would say there definitely can be. And a lot of that depends on the way that your keyword that you've chosen actually plays. Kind of an extreme example of that would be Big Hat. Big Hat and Sommer are a crew that basically every non-keyword model that you take is going to weaken the rest of the crew by a significant amount. And and I'm sure Maeve can attest to this, being that, she's played a lot of Sommer. If you can probably get away with taking maybe 1 or maybe 2, if you have 2 really critical out of keyword picks into that crew. But if you go more than that, you're really, really going to be struggling. Your model's stats aren't going to be high enough to reliably land hits. You're going to get, you're going to have fewer models around that you can use to, blow up with Sommer's various abilities. It's going to be more difficult for you to summon new Bayou Gremlins in Sommer 2. It's one of those things that particular crew really, really is going to struggle with taking a lot of out of keywords. Then you're going to have some other crews that kind of function pretty independently. And, there's a lot of examples of those out there that, the models kind of function well on their own. They really don't need any keyword support. Mawtucket would be a good example of that. I mean, there's really nothing in that crew that creates so much keyword synergy that going outside of keyword is going to be a detriment. And there's going to be models like that or masters like that in pretty much every faction.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to need trigger warnings if you're going to keep bringing up Big Hat.
Sure.
Like, I am
sorry,
still upset, but it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love him, and I keep going back. And it keeps getting hurt.
Yeah, it's an abusive relationship. I know. I get it.
It is.
Yeah. So long story short, long-winded answer. Yes, you can definitely tech pick too much, and it's going to be more of a problem in some crews than others.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say that, like, if you really are looking to go out of keyword quite a bit, what you want to find is the people that sort of play or the masters that sort of play in what we kind of refer to as like a super solo concept. So I would say in particular, Mawtucket is actually one that I think could go out of keyword fairly often and not suffer too much.
Yeah,
Outside of the
absolutely.
fact that you just don't have a lot of models because you're wasting points on those out of keyword extra higher points.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, any competitive game that I play with Ma, I almost always take either the Lucky Emissary as an out of keyword semi-tech, but also backup beater, or I'll go out of keyword for another big beater like an Alphonse or a Mancha Roja or something like that, because she operates pretty independently. She can support them by giving them focus and movement. Regardless of what model she takes in, there's no keyword lock stuff on her card, really. The rest of the models in her crew that are very good that I tend to lean on are also very inexpensive. So taking one big out of keyword beater doesn't really hurt that much. And she has some other models that supplement some of those other out of keyword beaters really well. Like if I happen to be taking a Sparks for whatever reason, analyze weakness or, hostile work environment or whatever, well, there's a pretty good incentive to then consider taking a out of keyword whiskey golem as my backup beater. It's kind of like peanut butter and jelly. They just work great together. Yeah. I almost always take an out of keyword model with her because she needs the frontline support. Her keyword can't provide her with any more frontline support because there's just nothing else that you can take. And she works well with everybody. So there you go.
Well, so when we're thinking about like our priorities of like how we think about tech picks, I would say like if you're talking about a casual game, everything kind of usually happens at once. You generally sort of like roll up your or you flip, I guess, or put on the app your game, and then like within minutes you're already getting your opponent's faction, your list, and your keyword master, that sort of thing. In a tournament, it's a little different, because a lot of times in a tournament you will get the pools ahead of time, and so like you have more time to think. So I guess looking at it, I guess we can talk about it from a competitive perspective. When you're thinking about like what tech picks do I need, what is in terms of like when you're thinking about the schemes and strats, the board itself, and your opponent's choices, what is your usual like shift down from where you go for like thinking about tech points? Like what's the first thing you generally think of when you're looking at like tech picks?
That's a good question. I would say probably the first thing that I think of is making sure that I have a plan to score my points. Now, to your point, a lot of times if you show up to a casual game, you've probably started the game in the app, at some point, maybe a couple of hours to even a couple of days ahead of time. You've had the encounter in there to look at. You kind of know what your LGS or your home table is going to look like just because you know what terrain is going to be around. You already know what your opponent's crew or your opponent's keyword is going to be usually well ahead of time. So like you've already had a ton of time to really think about what can I take into this matchup. Now that I don't think is really what most people would be interested in hearing about. I think that to my mind, what people would be the most interested in is how you make that decision when you come to a table where everything's not necessarily preset. You don't have a ton of prior knowledge of what the matchup and the game are going to look like. So in that circumstance, the very first thing that I tend to do is I make sure that before I put together my crew, I have a plan to score my points. And what I'll usually do is I'll put together a crew in the app. I'll basically put together one of my quote standard crews. I'll look at the crew really quick and say, okay, I have a model that can score, covert ops over here, or I have a model that I can score guard the stash at in my opponent's back corner over there because he's going to have a tough time getting to it and I should have free reign. I know what models I'm going to be using for this scheme. And then once I have my scoring kind of figured out, if I think of it, like I said before, sometimes I don't think of it. I'll look at my opponent's declared keyword and I'll say, okay, I need to bring XYZ model to deal with this specific issue. What can I cut and still have a solid plan to score my points? And then that's when I start looking at things like trimming out a Trixie Bell or, God forbid, trimming out a Big Brain Bryn, so that I can bring in something that's going to solve a serious problem that I see cropping up on the table.
So would you say that your game, your kind of order of priority is the scheme pool, the terrain, and then your opponent's
Yes.
models?
Yes, definitely. I always make sure that I have a plan to score my points before I figure out anything else. There have been times that that's come back to kind of bite me in the ass in matchups where I really should have made sure that I prioritized making sure that I have some kind of a tech piece to deal with an overabundance of pit traps or shadow markers, or, you know, name your poison.
Mm-hmm.
That approach hasn't always served me well, but I feel like it served me well most of the time, and it consistently is how I approach games at a tournament table.
Jim, what do you think?
It's very similar. I don't think about tech picks until I'm at the table. Terrain is far more important, and opponent, crew, and faction are far more important to me for purposes of picking a tech pick than the scenario itself. Because, you know, like Jesse said, I will if it's a tournament and I have the pools beforehand, I will absolutely be obsessing over them on my commutes to figure out what my default crew for that pool is going to be. And then once I get there, I can take a look and go, you know what? I was absolutely going to run Ma 1 on this pool, but there is just... it's a board that's covered in hazardous lava pits. Well, maybe I'm going to switch to Ma 2 here, because it still has a lot of the tech I wanted, or a lot of the core functionality that I wanted, but I need to add this in for terrain purposes. For my opponents, my personal play style is I want to focus on scoring. I want to ask more questions than I do answering my opponent's questions, because I'm bad at adequately counter-teching my opponents. I have tried. I'm not good at it. So I have to be better at making them have to answer my questions. So, for example, that's why I like playing Zip. Zip has concealment, which is a passive counter to anyone at range. But at Richmond, I played Roper, and he had his Daw crew. And he did the classic Daw run of dive a hanged and Daw into the middle of my crew turn 1 with all that nastiness, right? And I knew going into the game that Daw was coming. I looked at the board, and there were these big line of sight blocking pieces scattered around the board, and there was a couple choke points. I did not spend any stones on the Ruthless upgrade in that game. Instead, I spared a little extra, and I hired a 8th model. I hired a Bayou Smuggler. And I put the Smuggler and a couple of Skeeters on one side, Zip Earl and another Skeeter on a far other side, so I split my crew. And so this is not a tech pick, but I started adjusting my core crew play against Daw, and then after he dove, I just ran away. I used my speed and my ability to hide behind line of sight blocking terrain to counter what his crew was doing without having to spend stones on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it went well for me. But that's not specifically to the point of counter picks or to tech picks. But in there, my tech was I took a bunch of flying models on a board with lots of line of sight blocking terrain, and I used the flying ability to position myself where I couldn't be on your heels teleported to, as opposed to the obvious line, which is take Ruthless and punch face.
And you have to be careful with that, I think, specifically, like, you know, not, I don't want to get too much into, like, you know, oh, we're going to do this against this specific person, but, like,
Right.
The only Ruthless available in Bayou is from those cards, is from those upgrades. So you're looking at 2 models in your crew that will have Ruthless. Jackdaw is really, really good at killing models. So you have to be very, very careful with you have those 2 models, and they are your only game plan, because if he decides to just take down those 2 models, well, what are you going to do? You've wasted a whole lot of time. And that is a thing I think that's very important with counter picks that we do need to, like, cover, is that so this happened to me. I knew I was going into Richmond, and I knew there was going to be Damien there, and I had just not been able to figure out how to beat Damien. So I started working on looking at lists that beat Damien. And what happened is I focused way too much on counter picks against Damien. And then it turns out that those counter picks didn't even win me the game, because I was much more focused on how do I deal with this than I was focused on how do I win this game. And I think you have to be very, very, very careful when counter picking, or when making tech picks, especially counter tech picks, to not mess yourself up or not hurt yourself, because you lose the goal of the game is to score as close to 8 points as possible. The secondary goal of the game is to stop your opponent from scoring 8 points. That's like should be the main focus of gameplay a lot of times. And I think sometimes it's very easy to lose sight of that, right?
Yeah, definitely. And we're kind of harping on this Jackdaw example, but I think that it's probably just because it's a low-hanging fruit. I mean, he's a master that, like, you kind of really need to have some sort of a plan to deal with the terrifying, and usually that comes in the form of Ruthless. There was a time period where there were like 3 players in my meta that were all running Jackdaw, and it was before titles, so it was all Jackdaw 1. So, I mean, we just had to get comfortable with making sure that we took an appropriate number of Ruthless picks into that crew until basically all of them realized that we were onto them, and they just stopped playing them, because if you do happen to take enough and the right Ruthless models, Jackdaw has a really bad game. At any rate, there was a game that I played into him at a tournament. I ended up eking out a win, but only by a point. And it was it came down to the last couple of activations. But I took the, 2 models with the Ruthless upgrade in Bayou, Inferiority Complex. And they were models that weren't going to be getting the benefit out of the minion bonus, the bully. So I was really taking them just for, like, basically getting 1 or maybe 2 free focus in the game and Ruthless. But then I was like, hey, I'm also going to take 3 Bayou Gators, because they have Ruthless and he doesn't like Ruthless, and they have Execute, and whatever.
They're playing his game.
I was playing his game basically, because I took 18 stones, because I think they're 6 stones a piece, of models that I'm pretty sure are defense 5, 6, defense 5 and 5 wounds. They're 5 stones a piece. Sorry. Yeah. Defense 5 and 5 wounds with no other defensive tech that's worth a shit versus Jackdaw. And they all got murdered. I basically wasted 15 stones of that could have been 2 models that were scoring me points, while my other Ruthless beaters with the upgrades were dealing with his crew. They were barely even speed bumps. The hanged tore through them so fast it was a joke. So I overtech. Yeah.
Yeah, hanged. They're a problem sometimes. And we talk about Jackdaw a lot, but the thing is, like, Jackdaw is very, very good when Jackdaw is very, very good. if you do the things you need to do to sort of protect yourself from Jackdaw, then and the things he does, then he becomes a lot less hard, a lot harder for your opponent to score or to do with him, because Jackdaw is a master that pretty much only has the one plan.
And this is getting into something that I wanted to touch on, which is in other games they have this concept of skew. A skew list, for example, in Warmahordes would be a crew that leans really heavily into one specific mechanic. So much so that that becomes their question. Hey, I have terrifying on all of my models. Can you handle that many terrifying checks? And those are the best crews to make a point to tech against. I'm going to pick on Hoffman now because we've picked on Daw enough. Hoffman is the archetypal example of, can you deal with armor? And every faction now has some amount of armor ignoring triggers, actions, or irreducible damage. And then Hoffman has built in counter tech to that tech. And so I guess that begs a question for you all.
Mm-hmm.
When you're going into a match and you see what your opponent has as far as leader and faction, do you expect them to bring counter tech to your tech? And if so, do you try and Princess Bride it and go, I knew you were going to bring that ruthless thing, so I didn't bring my terrifying stuff, and instead I brought this. Ha-ha! Or do you not think about it that hard?
There have been times that I have done that. Specifically speaking, playing Mayfang, because I have played a good bit of her lately. And I mean, we can actually bring up an example of that in the Rusty Rumble, the game that you and I played, where I think I even said during setup of that game that was the only Mayfang game I had ever played that I hadn't brought the Metal Golem. Mm-hmm. Because I knew that you were playing Mawtucket. We had already agreed it was going to be Mawtucket 2, and you were playing into Mayfang, who I knew you had good answers to my armor in your crew. You could take things, Ma herself ignores armor. You've got the
hopper,
the rock hopper, which ignores armor. You have access to other models that can ignore armor. And I just knew that if I took the Metal Golem, it was going to turn into a scrap marker really, really, really fast. So I didn't take it. And it felt kind of weird when I was building the crew, but it worked out. I ended up taking some other models instead that I don't necessarily take all the time. And they performed the way that I needed them to. Kang was that example. Mm-hmm. Kang is not a model that I take very often. He's good, but he's a lot of points, and he's in a crew with a lot of other models that are either more efficient or do their jobs a little bit better. In that particular game, having a hard to wound henchman that could rail walk and hand out focus was a lot more valuable than, the maybe one good activation I was going to get out of the Metal Golem before it died. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think these are all really, really, really good points to talk about. There are times that you do need to, just step out of... I would say sometimes you need to step out of your comfort zone and grab that model that you think maybe might have this niche play and see how it goes. I wouldn't recommend this in a tournament play, obviously. Don't go for something you've never really played in a tournament. Try it out in your local games. But you can be surprised by how well a model will play into Kang, where it's oh, this is a model we've completely forgotten about in this keyword, but in this specific situation, suddenly he is doing something that we want. Mm-hmm. I think we see that playing Brewmaster. Anybody who plays Brewmaster, will tell you Whiskey Golem, Whiskey Golem, Whiskey Golem. I love the Whiskey Golem. He's the only real beater model in the keyword. However, if your opponent has played a lot of Brewmaster and knows Whiskey Golem is coming, Whiskey Golem has 6 defense and 8 wounds if they've got armor piercing. There does come a time where you can say, oh, if my opponent is playing Hoffman, for instance, Whiskey Golem is probably not going to stick around very long. So is there another model that could potentially fill that beater spot, like Alphonse, who, you know, Hoffman is going to have a harder time with?
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like this, you know, the Hoffman piece in particular, it kind of got me thinking a little bit about this might be more of a building a bench topic than a topic for this particular episode. But if you're choosing a keyword to take into a competitive scenario, like Jackdaw, for example, where if my opponent brings this tech, I am going to have a very, very difficult time winning. And if they don't bring this tech, I'm going to have probably a pretty easy time winning. But bringing a crew that kind of hits multiple marks that your opponent is going to have to think about teching against, a lot of times is going to be greatly to your advantage. So Hoffman is a great example of this. Hoffman isn't just an armor ball. Hoffman is an armor ball that also has a ton of healing and also has a ton of movement and has models that hit very hard, either, you know, both at range and in melee. Has models that he can make a defensive line of scrimmage with like the Guardian, for example. Can toss stuff up the board again with the Guardian so that he can set up a really powerful alpha. There's a lot of different things that you need to consider when you're playing into a crew like Hoffman. Whereas if you're playing into one like Jackdaw, who's kind of more one note, realistically speaking, you really just kind of have to be able to deal with the terrifying. And then by extension, that's going to let you deal with the other really scary models that he's going to bring, like the Hanged. Now, just turning off the Hanged's terrifying doesn't just, you know, shut them down. They have other stuff that they can do. But when you only need one type of tech to deal with a crew, it makes it a lot easier for your opponent to take advantage of, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, you don't have to spend as much when you're building your list to passively counter. So like another example would be you're playing Outcasts into Rasputina. Again, you hire Mad Dog. You've solved most of the tricks Rasputina has. You've taken away her ice pillars, her cover, and her big beater, the Golem, now is not going to have his armor.
Right.
Whereas, like you said, Hoffman he's a triple threat. He can sing and he can dance.
Yeah, and you kind of read my mind with that Mad Dog thing, because that's exactly what I was going to bring up with him, is that, you know, Mad Dog, he's not just a tech for one thing. He can do exactly what you said. He can get rid of the armor. He can pick up the destructible terrain. He brings the armor piercing piece as well. And you can pretty comfortably feel that if you take him for one job, there's a pretty good chance that he's going to be able to use his counter tech to deal with other things that your opponent can do as well. And if you can kind of hit 2 or even maybe 3 of those bases, then man, oh man, is he ever going to pay back his points.
So when we're thinking about these, and I think, like, so let's take a minute and talk about, like, are there any specific keywords that when you see them dropped, you're like, yep, now I really need to think about how to deal with this character, or how to deal with this, you know, this specific group of models that I know is coming? Or is it all kind of based on what necessarily you are playing?
No, I mean, there are definitely some that I feel like you have to have some sort of a plan in place. You know, without rehashing the ones that we've already talked about, because we've kind of talked about them to death, you know, your Hoffmans and your Jackdaws. There are definitely some other ones out there that, like, you kind of have to have an idea of how to deal with them. You know, I was talking about Ivan before. And while Ivan might not see a lot of table time right now, if you just roll up to a game and you let Ivan do what Ivan's going to do, and you don't try to put any serious speed bumps in his way or break up his deployment or deal with all of his concealment, you are probably going to have a really, really bad game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he would stand out to me as one that you really need to consider taking some tech picks into. There are a few others out there, basically any of the other, big, armor ball type crews like Hoffman, your Mayfangs, things like that. You're really going to have to think pretty hard about.
Mm-hmm.
There are some other ones that are very difficult to tech into, though. And maybe that's kind of getting off topic a little bit, but with the Ma Tucket piece that we were talking about before, that's a crew where if your opponent declares Ma Tucket, they could build their crew in like 3 or 4 different ways, and it can be fairly difficult to tech against. Basically, you need to have a plan to deal with the pit traps, but all the other stuff that the crew can do, it might not be worth trying to tech pick into them, because there's a good chance that they're just not going to take the armor, or they're not going to take the rooster riders that you need to hunt down on a flank, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's you can kind of hire yourself into a corner, so to speak.
Yeah, that's valid. I think I get the most value for teching when I tech against specific expected play styles. So, for example, there's the concept of the Alpha Strike crew. You had mentioned it. There's crews that can send something up the board to attack you bottom of turn 1. We've seen this with things like Nekima, with things like Seamus Original Recipe, and with Tiri and the Matron as the Boogeyman version right now. And stuff like that gets me thinking about, okay, I can expect a turn 1 attack. Do I have Take the Hit? Do I have Extended Reach? Do I have Disguised? Do I have physical terrain that I can stand on top of that they can't charge into range of me with? So that's an example of a matchup where I would know from the get-go that I would need to do some amount of tech, because those play styles are very telegraphed. As opposed to the Ma, where it could be any number of things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Teching against your opponent's expected play style rather than teching necessarily against the models. That's a really good idea, because the Matron not being a fantastic example of this because of technical reasons, but if you expect an early melee alpha and you have access to models, maybe even slightly less ideal models that have something like an extended reach, I mean, that could really mess up your opponent's turn 1 and give you a lot more breathing room.
To that end, just to speak from personal experience, at Nova last year, one of my last day opponents was bringing Yan Lo, and I declared Terra into Rezzers in that matchup. So it was Rezzers Yan Lo. And at that time, 33 hadn't been errataed yet, and so the kidnap was all the rage. I knew going into that game that the amount of extended reach available in Yanlo's crew is obscene. Monos has it because that model has every rule under the sun. I don't have feelings about Monos at all. Ashigaru had
fair
it.
And balanced. Fair and
yes.
balanced.
On 1 foot. He is fair and balanced on 1 foot. I think his totem even has it. And the player to the table next to me just looked at me and said, "You didn't declare Terra too? You're not doing the kidnap? What's wrong with you?" Something to that effect. And when we revealed the crews, sure enough, that entire crew had enough extended reach models to cover his entire crew. I took Terra 1 instead, so I kind of juked that incoming tech. That's only because I had played with and against Yan Lo recently before then and had been burned by that extended reach.
I think that's a great point. Absolutely. And thinking about ways to blunt opponents' alpha strikes, you might even start thinking in some pretty unusual ways. So maybe you're playing Returned, or maybe you're just playing Neverborn, and you happen to be playing into like a Perdita 2 or a Hoffman, something that you expect to get a lot of ranged pressure from, potentially even turn one. But then you look at the board and you're like, well, I mean, there's a lot of shooting lanes, but they're fairly narrow ones. And, maybe if I deploy my crew kind of in this area, there's a couple of like trees that are going to block line of sight, or a couple of buildings. Maybe I take Atharak and I drop some ward stones in between those things, kind of early turn one. And then I just block out half the table from his shooting lanes to give myself some room to breathe. Like, think that's probably more of a sometimes food than anything, but that's a good example of kind of like taking a lot of things into account: your opponent's play style, the models that you expect them to take, taking the terrain into account and how you might be able to use it to your advantage to choose a very unusual model, especially as like an out of keyword pick that could potentially save you the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's very important, like we said earlier, to like think about what you have access to in your keyword. And I think a tech pick doesn't necessarily have to be an outside of keyword model. It can be something that's like just not used all the time. Like we have models that we just don't give enough focus to, I think, sometimes. Because we usually want to look for like efficiency. We want to look at like what what like is the meta right now. So you look at those and you think like, okay, well, I know this guy is just going to get eaten up by Damien, so I'm not even going to bring him because I expect a lot of Damien. Well, if you don't play Damien, you can still bring this guy, and he might still do something for you.
100%. Meta discussions, and that's something you said at the very beginning, Jesse. Knowing what your local group plays absolutely informs this, because there is a Malifaux meta that exists in online discourse, and the one at my local shop is not it. My local guild player, one of my local guild players, swears by Perdita 1. He loves how that master plays. She clicks with him. It's frustrating in the best kind of way to see a master that is lampooned online do well in our local meta.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? While you might not expect to see a Perdita 1 or like an Ironsides 1 or one of those other style of masters at like a top table, or certainly a highly ranked table at a tournament, if if you haven't played against them very much, or you don't have a ton of experience, and they're allowed to kind of play their game, I mean, like Ironsides can make mincemeat out of your crew if she's piloted by a competent player, and you don't have a way to deal with all the crap that she can bring to the table, like her bring-its and her self-healing and her high min damage and like all the other stuff that she does. Well, relatively easy to counter if you don't play into her hands and you take a couple of key pieces. I mean, she can really ruin you,
Oh, yes. I have been that person who's like, oh, it's just Tony. She's just going to sit there and tie me up. No, she's going to drop min 4 bombs on my face.
Right. Bring it all my models out of my crew and into the danger zone, so that even if she can't finish them off, one of her other models is going to clean up afterwards and be freaking nigh on unkillable if you can't get stunned on her or cancel a couple of triggers, which almost nothing in the game can do anyway. It's a real thing.
Another example of something you may want to tech against is Obey Masters. I think, like, specifically Zoraida, because Obey's such a powerful effect. And there are certain things that are gotchas the first time you experience them with Obeys. Like, if you obey, the classic is you obey a rider, and then they don't use their fate tokens, so you use their fate tokens. Or if someone has focus on their model, you obey them and then you can use that focus. So knowing, I guess, rules interactions, like if you want to expand
Yeah,
it beyond
absolutely.
just obey,
Yeah.
knowing the rules interactions that could get you is something to
Yeah.
be mindful of.
Yeah, I mean, just remembering not to take a rider into Zoraida is pretty big deal, because you
Yeah.
don't want to put your pale rider or your hooded, God forbid, your hooded rider um, into a matchup against Zoraida, because she is going to make you pay for it.
Or not relying on like protected, to save you against one of those things. Anything that would say specifically like an enemy attack does this. Like if an enemy targets you, because if they obey a friendly model and attack you, that's a friendly model attacking you, not an enemy. So, there are instances of those rules that you really have to be aware of. So yeah, I guess playing a pick against an opponent not bringing a model is also potentially a tech pick. In which case, I think it's very important to have a model that does the same thing for you, ready to, or a similar job for you, ready to go, that won't be manipulated by whatever that particular interaction does. So, like if you normally take a rider, think about an emissary. Most of the emissaries are pretty big beaters. Maybe look into a model that's a beater that is not in your keyword. So you're taking maybe a whiskey golem or a something that like they might still be able to obey, but it's not going to be like devastating if they obey it.
Mm-hmm. One thing I have done, we have a Lucas McCabe player locally. I've started just not hiring henchmen into him because I've had too many games where Desper steals my stones, but that's a local meta sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you happen to have somebody who really likes playing Ivan too, I mean, remembering to not take any big beady enforcers or big beady minions that he can do one of the unresistible obeys from his secret plans upgrade, focusing more on smaller models that are less impactful on the game, or if you do take any big beaters, sticking to henchmen, that can definitely mess up his game plan a little bit. It's kind of a corner case one because it's such a specific tech, but I mean, if your opponent sees a bunch of juicy targets, well, maybe he's gonna swap up what his secret plans are for that game.
Just because you have a tech pick does not always mean that it's going to win you the game. I think that's a very important thought. Like, I brought Zoraida. I feel like I'm pretty good against, I can obey their models, and then if obeying that model, like if you get focused on obeying that model or dealing with this thing and you're not sticking to your game plan of scoring points, then things can get very bad.
Yeah. Or just to your point before, like being too overconfident in what your particular tech pick is going to actually do. I mean, I've got a good, quick little story about that, but basically there were a number of games and will probably still continue to be a number of games, although maybe less so now that we have another blow it to hell model in faction, but where I would take Pear Ravage, that guy, where I would take Pear because he was the blow it to hell model in Bayou, thinking that he was going to save my ass against like a Rasputina or whatever, pick your poison. And then his, defense 5, willpower 4, can't use stones. All he has is a little bit of shielded to stay alive. Ass gets fucking baked before I get a chance to actually do anything impactful with his blow it to hell. Or
and potentially explodes in your crew.
Potentially explodes in my crew. or I take him to deal with, like, for example, I took him one time in a Ulix game because I knew that my opponent had declared Rasputina, and I had Ulix with all these big, huge models, and I was going to have a terrible time dealing with all the stupid ice pillars. And then Pear basically just didn't do much of anything the whole game because I couldn't get him within range and line of sight of the ice pillars, or Raspy would just nuke him off the table in one turn. And I think I maybe got like 2 good blow it to hells off the whole game, and then he got killed because I had to risk him, and he ended up killing a couple of my piglets at the same time. It was not good.
No.
Nope. Definitely not good.
And that's why he's the only member of the kin that hasn't been adjusted.
Yep. Yeah. All right. So I think that covers kind of in a final thought, like are tech picks a necessary part of this game? And can you build lists that don't necessarily need to tech?
Jim, why don't you? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm going to say that no, they are not necessary. Yes, you can build lists that don't need to tech. Caveat, but the game is designed with them in mind, and you'd owe it to yourself to keep those options available to you. You can, like I have been at or bigger events, play the I am the aggro. You know, that classic Magic the Gathering article, who is the beatdown? I am not going to counter you. You are going to counter me or lose. You can approach the game from the perspective of you counter me or I win, sort of thing. And that might work for you. But that's a gamble, and I think as you grow in Malifaux and grow as a player, you will find that it'll be a better tool in your toolkit to be able to adjust your crews to fit the scenario.
Yeah, I would say, is counterpicking required? Can you build kind of just a generic crew that does the job that you need it to? Yeah, absolutely. And I've been known to do that with a couple of different crews. I feel like you could live without kind of going up to that next level of list building and meta knowledge, but I'll be honest, that's what I love so much about Malifaux. The way that crews are, the timing at which crews are built and when they're declared, and having the opportunity to build your crew around what you expect your opponent to do, to pick those, counter picks, instead of just going to like a, pick your other game where you register your army list before the start of the event and you play that army every single round. And, there have been some other miniatures games that have adopted things akin to like a sideboard, like they'd have in Magic, where you could flex in and out a certain number of points, or you could flex in and out a certain number of units. But the joy that I get out of Malifaux has a great part to do with the way that the games are actually set up and hiring is done. And I love it. So I would not want to go without it. I think that it's an integral part of the game.
I agree with that 100%. Like it's definitely one of those things. And there are people, and there are very successful players who build lists that don't necessarily need to tech, or they only need to tech like a piece, a small thing here and there. And I think that if that is your style, if you want to build, but if you're going to build a list like that, then the tech kind of needs to be built into your core list. Your core list has to be able to answer all of the questions, which is difficult to do. Not every keyword is going to have that ability to, to answer every question, or at least enough of the questions to be able to win the scenario. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, and I think we see that pop up. That's the reason It's the reason why Damien is so very popular right now.
Mm-hmm.
Is because he answers so many questions so efficiently, and he asks your opponent questions that they have a difficult time answering. But even then, that's just not the way I like playing the game. I like having those. I like having to ask questions every time I jump to the board to say, "Oh, what am I playing? What am I going to do?" I like having a whole selection of models that I want to choose from. And spending time going, okay, this is the list I want to build. This is the, this particular scenario, this particular pool has me baffled. What am I going to bring? I like those questions. I think they're a lot of fun to ask. And I would say, I would go out on a limb and say the majority of Malifaux players probably play more of that way. I don't know too many Malifaux players that, even top level players, that only play one specific list. Caveat being there are some that are, and they're really good.
Yeah.
There's always an exception to the rule, right?
There is. And, I really want to emphasize that point you just made, Maeve, about it's not the way that you like to play the game. And yeah, I play the game as much for the aesthetic of a certain crew at a certain time as I do their rules. I am 100% happy to play a crew that is not going to function mechanically well if it looks good on the table for that day or for that event, except Big Hat.
Just had to get that in there, right?
I did. I'm sorry.
Why do you hurt me, Jim? Why do you hurt me?
Because I share the same pain. You know what? I am optimistic that Big Hat will not always be as rough as it is, but that's a topic for a different podcast.
Yes, it is. All right. Does anybody have any other final thoughts to add?
No, I would say for anybody who has been running some of those more fixed lists, maybe you're just getting comfortable with a new keyword, or maybe you just don't tend to swap your list up as much as some others, give it a try. Next time you play, even if you're not trying to figure out what your opponent's going to bring, look at the scoring ahead of time, look at the table ahead of time, and do kind of what we talked about. Try swapping out one of your core models for another model that might do one of the jobs a little better, and just see how it goes. I think that you'll probably find that the more you're willing to flex outside of your kind of fixed core, the more you'll come to appreciate the level of complexity and freedom that Malifaux affords its players.
And also, feel free to come to the Discord and tell us how wrong we are. We love that.
Yes. True story.
But for real, that's one of the great things about wargaming in general, and I think one of the cool things about the flexibility of Malifaux, and part of the reason why it keeps me there, is that not everybody plays the same way, and you can be successful not playing the same way. If you go and watch games from that are streamed on YouTube for the Vassal series, you'll see that even among the top players, people play very differently. Sometimes they come to the same conclusions, but the way they get there is very, very different. And that's a fantastic aspect of this game.
With that said, that pretty much wraps up the topic for the evening. So, as always, keep your conversations boring and stay weird, folks. Hey, everybody. I'm Jesse.
Oh, was that our cue?
Maeve would be the next one in queue. We will start again. This is exactly the same thing that happened with the Steam Powered Scoundrels recording, which was pretty
I
funny.
just thought there was going to be more. Like, I was like, oh, you're Jesse. Okay.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
All right. Take 2.